Galimar, Rise of the Quantum Traveler, by Dan Adrian. Read for you by Dan Adrian. Prologue. United States Navy ship Niagara, July 12, 1858. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Cyrus stood on the deck of the Niagara, halfway between the forebraces and the mainsail, contemplating the events of his life that led him to this point. Was all of the work worth it? That depends on whom you ask. My wife? Well, he thought to himself. He had a continuous sense of being on a historic trip across the Atlantic. Knowing exactly where his wife's attitudes lay on the subject, though, he knew if it had been up to her, he probably wouldn't be here. She was a good woman, of course, but she just did not understand there is something in a man that drives him to achieve greatness. Then again, with the twists and turns of life that brought him to this day, his inner voice was beginning to agree with her. Cyrus West Field, entrepreneur, dreamer, successful businessman, sailor. Not really a true sailor, he was more along for the ride than anything else. All the planning he had done to get to this point ensured that all men on board knew their role and knew exactly what they needed to do. There were always unforeseen occurrences, but Cyrus did his best to keep any surprises to a minimum. Meanwhile, the captain of the Niagara sat at his desk below decks. Captain William David Hadwin was a good man. Having been in the military all his life, this particular mission was not what he had trained for, of course. He was a military tactician and warrior, with the ability to be as brutally cold as necessary to carry out his orders in the defense of his country. Now, though, he had been asked to perform this task, not for the defense of his beloved country, but simply to make it better, to make it more competitive in the commercial and strategy business. Captain Hadwin supposed that was enough to make it worthwhile. Actually, whatever the White House said was necessary was all he needed to make it worthwhile, in his book. He had been trained to accept orders without question and to carry them out in the most efficient manner possible. When in uniform, Captain Hadwin was an outstanding individual. With a 36-inch waist and 52-inch chest, he was never taunted, not that any on board the Niagara would even think of doing so. Handpicked for this voyage, each hand on deck knew what the captain expected, which wasn't that much different from what he expected from himself. Perfection. Captain Hadwin took one more look at the paperwork First Lieutenant Aaron Morgan handed to him earlier. Digesting the contents of the note, the captain decided he needed to receive comment from Mr. Field on this latest piece of information. Reaching for his coffee, he realized it had once again grown cold due to neglect. "Maybe I'll drink a whole cup by the time this voyage is up," he muttered to himself. The captain stood figuratively, sometimes literally, at the helm of the Niagara, a stout ship in the service of the United States of America. Built by William Camp & Sons Shipbuilding Company of Philadelphia, it was the most modern military ship of the 19th century, and one of the first to be built with a hull almost exclusively of iron. It was strong, and was manned by an equally strong crew. While the current task at hand was more of a peacetime mission, it was a mission he was going to make sure was successful. Captain Hadwin was willing to stake his 25-year reputation it would be. Pushing himself back from the desk in his quarters, the captain stood and donned his cap. Leaving his quarters and stepping past the door to sick bay, he turned left and proceeded down a long corridor lined with various doors and passageways. At the third passageway, on the right, he turned and climbed a few steps. Upon getting to the top of the stairs, a simple turn of the door handle led him to the command center of the Niagara. "Captain on deck," announced First Lieutenant Morgan. Immediately all stood at attention. "As you were," commanded Hadwin. The command center of the Niagara was an impressive room. Even though this ship wasn't the newest, Navy leadership made sure this vessel had all the latest in marine technology. Recently it had been in dry dock to refit it for the task at hand, paying out its share of over 4,000 kilometers of cable across the Atlantic. Supposedly, this cable would make it possible to send and receive telegraph signals all the way to England for the first time. Many of the interior decks and berths were converted to handle storage of the cable that would be laid. Surveying the command center, the captain was pleased to see each station being manned expertly, and that the crew was working together like a well-oiled machine. Aaron, who was now stepping down from the command seat at the center of the room, was a man whom Hadwin would feel comfortable with captaining this ship all by himself. Having worked under the captain for 2 years, Lieutenant Morgan had proven time and again he was quite capable. Then there was Jim Espinosa, Chief Navigation Specialist. This voyage was to be Jim's last tour, since next month he was to marry a lovely woman he met in Boston last year when on liberty. Keeping an ever-intent watch on the crew members seated in front of him who had their hands on the controls, Jim made sure their movements were exactly what they should be, since his butt would be in a sling if anything went wrong. Moving near the captain's chair, a yeoman handed Hadwin a cup of black coffee. Privately thankful for this fresh cup of determination, he sipped from it as his eyes scanned the horizon. "Status report, Mr. Morgan," commanded the captain. "All proceeding according to plan, Captain. Since the last report, we have sailed all night. We are nearing point Gamma 23. We should arrive there in 30 minutes, sir." "Very good, Lieutenant. Notify me once Gamma 23 has been reached. I'll be on deck if you need me," acknowledged the captain. "Yes, sir." With coffee in hand, Captain Hadwin exited the command center, making his way up the deck and the open air. It didn't take long for him to find Mr. Field. The news he had received in his quarters earlier was something Cyrus needed to know. Meanwhile, Cyrus was in his own reverie as he scanned the endless sea. Turning to his own personal logbook, which he was never without, he found the last entry. July 12th, 1858, 7 a.m. This morning we sent a test signal to the Agamemnon, and all seemed to be working well. As they continue to lay cable toward the Irish shore, we continue ourselves in the opposite direction without incident. The signal continues to remain good, and they even reported that there were whales following their ship. I guess they were escorting them, eager to be counted among those present for a turning point in the history of man. Cyrus looked up and contemplated what history would say about him as a man. He made sure all those around him read him as a man whose convictions were unshakable. Cyrus supposed he got much of that from his father, Reverend David Field, still found preaching where Cyrus grew up in Connecticut. Through his father, Cyrus was able to trace his family tree straight back to the Revolutionary War. His grandfather was an officer in the American Army. Cyrus had never served his country in this manner, but was proud of his heritage and had always set himself on doing all he could for his country. That is why he was here. He contemplated how there were those that had thought him to be a charlatan, and many more who thought him to be a hero. Cyrus continued the earlier entry. History will make its judgments, and all we can do is be men of good moral fiber. It is my sincere wish that the effort, anguish, disappointment, and success will all work to the benefit of my beloved country, the great United States of America. Looking up to the horizon again, the endless squeak of gears near his place on deck continued, as they paid out more and more of the transatlantic cable from the hold of the ship below. That noise, along with the sometimes foul stench of the gutta-percha lining used on the cable, allowing it to remain waterproof, was almost unnoticeable now. "Captain on deck," announced an anonymous deckhand. All stood at stiff attention. Cyrus lazily swung his eyes from the horizon to the general direction of the deckhand, making the announcement. "As you were," said Captain Hadwin, with a look on his face that somewhat resembled a scowl. It was always a scowl, observed Cyrus, but this time it seemed more strained, more tense. "Mr. Field," called out the captain, "may I have a word with you?" As is typical for the captain of a ship, Hadwin wasn't much for small talk. Cyrus figured he distanced himself from his men so as to maintain a continuous air of command and control. "Of course, Captain. What can I do for you?" I had my first mate take an inventory of the cable storage hold, tasking him with estimating how much cable remained in the hold. At the same time, I had my navigator give me information on our current position. I'd like you to take a look at the numbers and tell me what you think. "Lead the way, Captain." The two men made their way across the deck. The weather this morning was good. The seas had no anger in them. That was why this time of the year was chosen. It would be impossible to lay cable under a nor'easter or any other semblance of foul weather. Getting to the bridge, the captain guided Cyrus over to the table next to the navigation station, where various papers and navigational materials were typically used. After clearing out the charts, he got a clipboard where he had previously scribbled some notes. "As you can see here, it looks like we've laid about 800 miles of cable, which means we should have about 550 miles left in the hold. However, according to the latest estimates, there are actually 490 miles left." "How is that possible?" Cyrus asked, now very concerned. I asked the same question of my navigator, and he seemed to be just as baffled. He got out a sextant to check the position, and it turns out we have veered off course. He swore he's been keeping a close eye on the compass, but the fact remains. The captain hesitated as he looked at some other figures he had written down. "According to my calculations, we will still have enough cable to make it, due to the extra you had insisted on before shoving off, but we'll be cutting it close." "Indeed, close is right," agreed Cyrus. "Do you have any idea why the navigator is wrong?" "Well, Captain, may I speak to you for a moment?" interrupted Navigator Espinosa, who had quietly come up behind them. As Captain Hadwin started to walk toward him, the navigator said, "Actually, sir, this concerns Mr. Field, too." "Okay, proceed," said the captain as he returned to his seat. "You know how we were talking about the current navigational position and how I guarantee we have been moving exactly the way the compass has pointed we should be moving?" asked the lieutenant. "Yes," replied Hadwin in an understanding tone. "Well, I just couldn't get it out of my head that being where we are, where the sextant says we are, just doesn't make sense. The two things just don't add up, sir." "Okay, what's your point?" said the captain, wanting to know why he'd been interrupted. "I'm sorry, sir. I went back over the charts and started plotting out our positions. Here, take a look." He stretched out the chart he'd been holding in his hands. Espinosa pointed to a line marked in red stretching from a midpoint in the Atlantic and said, "You see, this is our course over the last 3 weeks. However, if you look here," he pointed to a spot west of the rendezvous point in the Atlantic, "you can see we started to veer slightly north. It appears that's the main reason we are off course now." "Okay. Have you figured out why that happened at that point?" asked the captain, almost to himself. He was actually intrigued now. "I asked myself the same question, and so I looked up that particular date, and it was the date the cable broke, and we had to dredge it up with a grappling hook, remember? That was when that deckhand accidentally locked up the brakes and snapped the line." "Right," acknowledged Hadwin. Espinosa continued, "Captain, do you have that little trinket that came up on the grapple line that time?" "Yes, right here." He opened a drawer in the desk adjacent to the navigator's station, producing what looked to be an artifact made of gold, which was roughly oval in shape. There were several odd markings on it, and the front had a flat surface. "If I may, Captain?" The navigator held out his hand, took the artifact from the captain, and swung about a foot or so, holding it near the compass. As soon as he did, the compass started spinning continually. With wide eyes, Hadwin asked, "Are you saying the whole reason we're off course is from a compass altered by this thing?" "Yes, Captain, I believe so. Notice that if we move it to the other side of the room—" Espinosa strode to the other side of the room and set it down. Looking back to the compass, it now appeared to settle and show they were indeed off course. "Great," growled the captain. Looking around him, Hadwin picked out a first-year sailor, eager to please, and said, "Seaman, take that damn trinket down to my quarters and leave it on my desk." "Yes, sir." The captain was really angry now, but he no longer had a recipient for his anger other than himself. He had placed that thing so near the compass, and there was no one to blame for the current navigational predicament but himself. The meeting was then adjourned, and the rest, as they say, is history. The transatlantic cable was successfully laid, and it worked for a grand total of 28 days. After a board of inquiry looked into the issue, it became clear it was the fault of an English doctor turned electrician who had driven so much current down the line he burned out the wire. A few short years later, after the American Civil War, it was tried again, and the cable was a complete success. In the end, history mysteriously recorded that electricity coursing through the cable on board caused the compass to be off, not the influence of some trinket the captain had placed near it. The trinket made its way to the headquarters of the Maritime Admiralty, and, after sitting in a drawer of an unremarkable desk for quite some time, eventually into the basement of the New York Museum of Natural History, with an obscure title on it reading, "Field Expedition No. 5894.